president of Africaine Bank. It was actually, in my career, the first time I was applying fully for a job. Usually I was handpicked. So I said, but why should I go to Cairo? He said, no, it's a very important institution. And send me the economists, which are the advert. I did apply, and the rest is history. I met President Edward, who was in the panel who was interviewing me, and I was asking myself, but what would I do in such a place? Technically, I thought I was equipped, but never worked in such an environment, particularly a startup, as you said, and an African startup. But I think at that time I made the right choice. When eventually I was successful in my application, and President Edodu gave me 1 month to join, which was too short for a family, a father of 5 children, to just stop everything and go to Cairo. I asked if I could have an extra month. He said no more than that. So I eventually went there. He gave me a lot of documents to start reading. And he said, you have about 15 days to find a house. Finding a house in 15 days in Cairo in 1996 was not a straightforward matter. So eventually I had to call my wife to come and look for the house, because after 1 week, President Edodu called me and said, I hope you're finished reading those documents, because trade finance cannot wait. You have to hit the ground and run. So that's how we started. And of course, the basic thing that was being done at that time was building the foundations. Because by the time I got there in 96, the bank was still at the startup, as you call it. So we were at that stage. And it was effectively for me the first time I was creating something, but he has created Nexi at the time. So I was just following his steps.
Fascinating. Thank you, President. I'll combine 2 questions in one, if you don't mind. The first, in the Vista Bank sponsored hologram of President Babacar Ndiaye, the visionary, as we've all recognized. He talks about traveling to Cape Town and seeing the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, and that anchoring him from an inspiration point of view. Question number 1 is, what was that anchor inspiration for you in the work during your tenure at Africaine Bank, is the first. The second question, the theme is building on decades of resilience. The word resilience for you.
Trying to deal with or recall the motivation of Ndiaye. As I said earlier, if you look at the feasibility study that informed the establishment of the bank, everything that was in it was about short-term trade finance. There was no, it didn't have about long-term, even medium-term. As I said, it was after the first meeting in Cairo, it was all short-term. Some participants hinted at the possibility of longer-term facilities by the bank, but eventually the idea was a footnote. By the time we got to Zimbabwe, ideas had matured, and people now began strongly to talk of longer-term financing. So the original motivation of Ndiaye was deal with the gap created by retreating banks, because of what had happened initially. Now, responding with both short-term facilities by our bank and longer-term facility was something that came later and required what, as I ponder the DNA of the bank, required resilience, capacity to tolerate other views, capacity to tenacity, grit, capacity to look ahead and deal with, resist difficulties. So the original idea of India was a short-term financing bank, and this now matured later. And as I look at what this bank has become, it was not intended as a development bank. But much of what we're doing now is development. And much of what we're doing now is responding to change and adapting our tools to bring those changes. And what it has meant is that in our DNA is this issue of resilience, capacity to respond to difficulties, capacity to deal with painful conditions. And therefore, I want to commend those who really articulated it. It is the critical part of the African Bank DNA. And if there's anything I would recommend that our team take away from this, is to recognize that as a cultural issue. It has become the culture of the bank. Whether we are talking about the way we dealt with Zimbabwe as a result of the effects of land reform, or the way we dealt with the problems of Kenya as a result of a couple of local problems, or the way we dealt with supporting trade services, or even longer-term project finance that sometimes had nothing directly with trade itself, quality assurance, and the kinds of production centers that we now have around our continent. Those were not necessarily issues that were anticipated. These kinds of responses mean that we have resilience in our DNA.
Thank you, President. And I think you bring out some really important points that I think people who are maybe not inside the institution may not have insight into. I think it's an important lesson. I mean, the migration from short-dated instruments to longer-dated instruments, assets and liabilities, is really out of a market need. And that's the proposition of African Bank, that we respond to market demand. It's very difficult to trade if you don't have trade-enabling infrastructure, for example. President, the 2 points, your inspiration.
Well, I can simply add a few things. You know, you also have adversity, which you have to deal with. It's not only the external environment as a geopolitical or economical environment, which is there to stay. The economic and geopolitical situation of the late 80s, beginning of the 90s and so on, was an environment that led to the creation of the bank. So you develop the instrument to deal with that. But beyond this, you have adversity. When the bank was being established, the whole issue or idea of Afro-pessimism was prevailing. I remember vividly before I came to the bank, a few months before, I was at a dinner with a diplomat, a German diplomat, who was saying that Africans cannot manage banks. He said it at the dinner, just in front of everybody.
Is he in the room?
No, he cannot be here. And it was a time when the World Bank was doing the so-called structural adjustment program, and many banks were being closed in the continent. In my own country, in 1.5 years, 4 banks were closed. Development Bank. So, when someone makes such a statement, for me, it's an adverse statement. It's someone who does not want you to succeed. So, to deal with that, you have to develop the proper attitude to show that it's not because you are African, but you are a human being who can actually achieve things. And you develop that culture within the bank of how can we do something rather than why can't we do it.
Thank you, President. And a question to both of yourselves, President. Africaine Bank, and I think institutionally we say this with all humility, has grown and developed to become systemic in the African economy. How do we sustain it?
Say that again.
Africaine Bank has become systemic in the African economy. How do we sustain it?
Oh, a very interesting question. As I said earlier, so many of our earlier speakers said resilience is not enough, perhaps. Well, I think resilience is a lot. People like Paul Collier, an icon in African development issues, I said, problems of Africa are so many that it's really pointless listing them. They are fairly well known. To talk about the problems is probably pedestrian. The question is what to do about it. Now, if you look at our past, the way we have responded to those problems has meant that the bank has cultivated resilience, capacity to respond to problems, capacity to bear the pains and deal with risks as they emerge, capacity to deal with new issues. Once the bank has this and equally develops innovation, that equips it to face the situations as they emerge. Whether the problems are internal to the bank, internal to Africa, or they are motivated by geopolitical conditions as are emerging now, the resilience the bank has developed equips it. Whether we are dealing with treasury issues, the bank is non-deposit taking, but was equipped with the capacity to go to the market and seek resources. But the market is being strained. For example, about 2 to 3 weeks ago, I heard of problems of rating the bank. But the bank is rated by several agencies, but even if its rating declines and therefore accessing the market is affected in some way, the bank has cultivated the resilience to deal with that problem. The bank has got the innovative capacity to deal with that, to access funds. I want the bank to establish an internal recognition of this DNA feature as part of its culture. Once you recognize this, that equips you to deal with the future.
Thank you, President.
Yeah,
President
I think he just said it. That's a question of culture. We have to make sure that the younger generations that are coming to the bank understand the culture, understand the objectives. It's never over. You know, you have to continue to fight. You have to continue to fight. And the external environment is changing. But one thing that seems to change very slowly is the recognition of the place of our continent in this whole global world. The way the Africa continent is drafted in the map monde is a small continent, whereas it has the size of 3 times Europe and so on. Everybody knows that. The perception that others have is such that we are pushed down. So you have to have a culture of fighting. And that needs to be passed on to the younger generation. I remember when I took over for President Eduardo, and I spent 5 years here, I was reflecting on how to turn the bank into a meaningful agent. At that time, our total balance sheet was 500 billion, and the total African trade was about 1 trillion plus. So I said to my colleagues, unless we reach at least 1 billion, we will be meaningless. The staff said, no, 1 billion, you double? Eventually, in a year and a half, we reached more than 1 billion. 5 years later, we reached 3 billion. 10 years later, we reached 7 billion. Now, the bank is at almost 40 billion.
So, President Accra, you mentioned uncertainty. The global environment today, within the context of the continent and the important role of the bank, President Orama has served his term. We're going into a transition period. What would you advise a new leadership?
It's me or...
I will begin with yourself, sir, and then I'll come to President Eduardo.
Well, simply when you talk about the uncertainty, I think by definition, there will be uncertainty all the time. Otherwise, you are in a riskless environment, a risk-free environment. In any environment that...
Forgive me, President, but I think there are certain dynamics today, like aggravated protectionism, for lack of a better word, which has impact on trade.
Yes, they are there. They can be of different nature at any point of time. But uncertainty will always be there. It can take different forms. That's at least in my view. So, one, to be alert, because you as an institution has been created to deal with issues, to deal with challenges. So you have to be alert. I also remember again when there was this COVID outburst, I called President Orama and I said, you know, what I saw is going to affect our continent. He told me, about a week ago, we had a meeting in the bank to already discuss how to address it. I felt so happy because they were ready to look at the environment and say, what should we do about things that can affect our continent? And I'm talking about profound reflection. I'm talking about deep reflection. And coming up with instruments to deal with them. I think there is this culture already in the bank. What I will ask new leadership is to simply continue to apply. President Eduardo started saying by saying, when we started the bank, he said, let's put system in place, not people.
Yeah.
You put systems in place. If the systems are in place, then success is already there.
Thank you, President. President Adol, within that, there's I think what the bank has done really well, and also President Ekra touches on this, what the bank has done really well is groom a breed of young, very talented Africans and given them huge responsibility, which I think has been what has built the culture and has anchored the resilience of the bank. In one of our discussions, you mentioned the process of bringing your successor president from the beginning, and you mentioned some of the why him rather than anybody else. Would you be able to share with the audience? Because I just think it's important. These are decisions that young African bankers will be faced with. Why President Ekra at the time?
That is an interesting question to raise about what else in the bank. There is a profound point that kept on arising as the bank defined its mission, defined and redefined its mission. Part of the DNA of the bank is continuously defining and redefining its vision in the light of the circumstances. One of the founding fathers of the bank kept on telling us this bank was not created necessarily for reasons of finance. The money put in the bank by Nigerian entities, if they were looking for profit, they will use the money and set up Nigerian banks to make profit. Egyptian banks, the money they put in the bank could have been used in the same way. The critical thing is developing African systems and bringing African integration to bringing African development. Now, who are the people to bring this about? At the time the bank started, even recruiting Africans, even headhunting Africans to fill vacancies was difficult. You couldn't find people. Because African institutions had already shown a history of failures, a history of poor performance, and somebody say, "Oh, another one is being set up in Cairo. Maybe it will last 1 year, and you wind up." As you remember, although our charter provides for a 3-year tenure for board members, the very first board members were given 1 year. The fear then was that within 1 year the bank will fail, like others had. So if you wanted to recruit people, it was a huge problem. But today, as I look into the bank, I see highly skilled people, highly motivated people. Attrition rate, people withdrawing from the bank, is perhaps the lowest you can think of in the industry. So we have the team, and it is something one must be proud of, that we had a team that with resilience could develop the instruments to deal with the problems and challenges we have in the trade finance arena in our continent today.
President Adordu, President Ekra, thank you so very much. I think they deserve a bigger round of applause than that.
Now, in 3 decades of powering African resilience and transformations, what lessons can we learn from the Africaine Banque experiment? That's exactly the question. The next esteemed and rather eclectic panel will demystify for you. And your moderator is probably a very familiar face to almost everyone in this room. Please welcome her as she welcomes her panel, BBC's Miss Lerato Mbele.
What do you want? No, it's okay, it's okay.
Okay, I think so. It's working. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, thank you very much for your patience and thank you for being with us this lunchtime. My name is Lerato Mbele and it is my pleasure to be hosting a conversation titled 3 Decades of Powering Africa's Resilience and Transformation. What does the Africaine Banque experiment teach us? So, as has been mentioned extensively this morning, this is an institution founded in May 1993. Primarily at the time with the aim of funding trade expansion on the continent. The lender itself predates the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and area, but I think it serves as a precursor to that project of regional integration. It is a precursor for the trade infrastructure that was necessary to be built and established. It is a precursor for the payment systems and bank coordination and connectivity that was subsequently created through SWIFT banking systems. It's a precursor for manufacturing, industrialization, and value addition for made-in-Africa goods. And also, it is a precursor for facilitating access for small and medium enterprises on the continent. The question is, since 1993, has Africaine Banque realized its mandate, or has it even exceeded its mandate? And that's the essence of the conversation we're going to be having here today. Okay. Joining me is Professor Bart Naji, the Chief Executive Officer of Geometric Power, a scientist, a former Federal Minister of Power, and an expert on building resilience for future economies. If he can join us now on stage, we're really delighted to have you. We also have Mr. Ki Chong Lee, a board director for Africaine Banque. He is a financier, preeminent. He has worked extensively in the fields of hedge funds, the Mauritius Bank, tax laws, and trading across different jurisdictions. And so really and truly, when we talk about how MDBs coalesce with commercial banks, this is his expertise. Mr. Ki Chong Lee, please join us. We also have Madam Rosa Whittaker, the President and Chief Executive of the Whittaker Group. She's been extensively involved in trade negotiations. She's a policymaker, a former U.S. Assistant U.S. Trade Representative under the presidency of Bill Clinton, and she can really speak to the diaspora links, bringing together Africa and the big economies of the world. So thank you very much for joining us, Ms. Rosa Whittaker. We also have Mr. Aliyu Ahmed, from the Federal Ministry of Finance, in charge of Africa and bilateral economics. Obviously, he can speak to the complexity of political economies in Africa, you know, the complexity of doing things like negotiating and consensus building when there are delayed appropriation bills in Parliament, how you deploy public funds, dealing with issues of liquidity in an economy as well. So thank you very much for your time, sir. And we're also joined by the Honourable Patrick Anthony Chinamasa, former Minister of Finance for Zimbabwe. Obviously, the Honourable Minister would know very much how you manage budgets in the midst of turmoil and crises, and also you know how you work around risk aversion. So thank you for your time, Professor Chinamasa. Thank you so much for being with us. And I hope we've sorted out our technical microphone. I think the first thing I want to do is perhaps defer to you, Mr. Key Chong Ling, and say we have a situation where this is an organization funded by African governments for the purposes of Pan-African development and trade. With that Class A shareholding by African states, has that identity helped to really direct the mandate of Banque in the last 30 years? Because they needed to understand that what they do is for Africa and in the broader interests of the shareholders who are African governments.
Yeah. So this is an institution of Africans, owned by Africans, designed by Africans, fit for purpose for African development. Basically, firstly, for trade finance and to close the trade finance gaps for the development of the continent. But basically, this mandate has been really exceeded. And for this, we need to have two things. One is capital, and the second is liquidity. Today, we are happy to say that Banque is very well capitalized and is perfectly liquid.
Right.
So it has a crisis preparedness and a resilience that helps it to intervene very fast and very rapidly in case of external shocks or in case of any commodity crash or a pandemic.
Fantastic.
So this has helped Afrexim to play a very useful role, very fast, very quickly, in a responsive manner, and fit for purpose.
Okay.
So that's the main advantage of having an African bank with full financial sovereignty,
right,
which is context-sensitive to the African situation.
Right. I want to latch onto this term context-sensitive, Professor Bart Naji, because, you know, some people would say that is a dilemma in itself. When you are an African institution capitalized by African states, working on a continent that is vulnerable to vulnerabilities, for instance, you know, there would obviously be constraints of capital that the shareholder countries are facing, let alone capitalize the institution itself. Does its African identity create limitations for Banque, or has the organization actually been able to supersede those limitations and expand its mandate?
Thank you. First, let me salute the President Orama and his team at Banque for the phenomenal work that they have done to really advance African economy. In our own company, it has been particularly quite impressive. So now, yes, thank you. Banque's role has become something that all the institutions that used to to want to do something in Africa can now emulate. Because there is that statement made earlier by someone that where the others step back, Afro-Exim Bank steps forward. Yeah. And as that institution, the African, being owned by African countries is quite profound, because that is where they are able to progress, because it is totally African. The other institutions that are much more diverse have profound limitation, because people have different interests that they bring on board, but they don't have it. They have taken the fate of Africa in their own hands, and they are moving forward. And that, to me, that's why they have been able to take decisions. They are very rigorous in their processes, but with that, they are confident that what they are doing is for advancement of the continent. So that's how I see it.
Fantastic. In a short while, I will ask you to give us a very concrete example, but I want to bring our other speakers in. Mr. Aliyu Ahmed, let's bring you into the conversation, because as we say, the context of today creates a complexity of sorts. Liquidity issues, governments that are managing heavy debt burdens and high repayment rates. There is a demand on resources by citizens of each country. It's either infrastructure or education or healthcare. So the money is really spoken for, and the resources are quite scant and thin. Do you think that when we're talking about the balance sheet of Afro-Exim Bank, with the competing demands for African resources in the quest for a complex development trajectory, have they been able to overcome a lot of those limitations? Have they been able to think outside the box? I'm thinking here of the 2015 counter-cyclical trade liquidity facility, managing different exogenous factors, the COVID, etc. Have they always been able to step up to the plate?
I think so, to be honest. If you look at what Afro-Exim Bank has done over the years, and the evidence that we have right now in terms of capitalization of Afro-Exim Bank, is to the contrary. Because countries have realized that over the years, all other banks who are non-African in terms of character would not step up in their times of difficulty. So, in the latest capitalization that was done in the bank, most of at least the big players in the continent, the largest shareholders came up. They were able to step up to the plate to ensure that they appropriately capitalize Afro-Exim Bank. So in that respect, I would say that the evidence that we have is quite to the contrary. And this is because the countries in Africa have seen what Afro-Exim Bank has done. Over the years, in their times of difficulty, you see most of these banks retrenching. I think I was quite impressed when I was listening to the history of how Afro-Exim emerged. So they are used to banks retrenching from the continent. When they could no longer, we had just a few minutes ago that it was quite difficult to raise short-term financing, as some of the banks providing this had left the continent. That was the genesis for the creation of Afro-Exim Bank.
Yeah.
And this has become a culture in the institution. Whenever other banks are leaving, Afro-Exim Bank would step in.
Right.
They will work with you to try to see that they solve the problem.
Right.
So I'm quite impressed by the terminology used by Samala Zubairu. They are there as first responders.
Yeah.
And why are they able to do this? It's because I think they have the support of their shareholders.
All right.
Strong support.
Let's stay with the analogy of first responders, because it's a health analogy. And post-COVID, Rosa Whittaker, many governments were under pressure to really step up in an unprecedented situation and in an unprecedented way. We are now in that post-COVID era. and we thought we dealt with that crisis, but there are many other permutations of crises. Now we're dealing with ODA declines, tariff wars internationally. So as the world changes right before our eyes, what role does an Afrexim Bank play in helping African countries or businesses navigate additional complexities in the contemporary world?
Well, thank you very much. Let me just first say, to coin a phrase from that great author, Jim Collins, the who is more important than the what.
Yeah.
Because if you have the right who, that who with other who's can figure out the what. And I think the lesson that we've learned from Afrexim Bank is the importance of leadership. And I want to pay tribute to President Obama. And we really should pay tribute to him because he is the architect of modern African economic Pan-Africanism. Modern economic Pan-Africanism, and a true patriot. And this is not to say too much because it really goes into the solutions that you're talking about. Under his leadership, Afrexim Bank has been more than a bank. And to really address some of the challenges that you've mentioned, it would have to be. What has been ignited here is a movement that has turned aspirations into action, and a movement that we must continue. So the best thing we can do is to continue the economic blueprint that Afrexim Bank has engineered. And I have a word for it. I call it Afrocatalyst, the Afrocatalyst model, because it has been the catalytic lever integrating trade finance with technology, with a global diaspora, and so many counter-cyclical instruments.
The Honorable Patrick Chinamasa, part of our topic today is about resilience, how you build resilience. And I think as the former finance minister of the state of Zimbabwe, you would understand exactly what it is to operate in a truly constrained, squeezed environment where you have to be resilient on a variety of levels. I don't know what resilience means to you, but perhaps you can give us your definition of resilience. Perhaps, Honourable Minister, you can give us your definition of resilience, yes, and how in the Zimbabwean case, or certainly from your vantage point, you experienced in Afrexim Bank have helped you navigate some seriously complex environments.
Thank you very much, Moderator. To start with, Zimbabwe is a good case study for resilience. And we were supported very strongly by Afrexim Bank. Talking of resilience, you cannot beat the resilience of the Zimbabwean people.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention that we were slapped with illegal sanctions in the past 25 years. We are still under sanctions by Western illegally imposed sanctions. We are still under them. No one gave us a chance to survive, except Professor Urama, who believed in us. And through his bank, we have come out of the wood completely. Things have never been the same again. And we are now marching towards an upper middle class economy by 2030. Under his guidance and under the guidance of our president, Dr. Mnangagwa, we have now grown into one of the top 5 toppest economic growing rates in Africa.
Right.
Because Africa's problem is that we are exporting raw materials. We are very rich in minerals, in soil, but we export them as raw materials.
Yeah.
Zimbabwe has now banned the export of raw materials in order to power our reindustrialization.
Right. I want to challenge you just a second there. Because you say, with all the difficulties that Zimbabwe has faced with international sanctions, African Bank believed in you, right? Yes. So there's a context, the whole political economy context. And foreign lenders would say, there's high risk in Zimbabwe. How then did African measure risk in Zimbabwe when the rest of the world says, don't go to Zimbabwe? Why would they go to Zimbabwe?
Well, I think they are a Pan-African bank. They believe in Africans. And they have no other ulterior motives to oppress the people of Africa, but to empower them to take, so that Africa can take its proper place in the Committee of Nations. They understood why we were under sanctions.
Okay.
And they went out of their way to assist us. Also, you know, the problem of integration we are talking about, there is need for infrastructure by way of roads or railways.
Right.
African Bank was a co-lender in the upgrading of Byte Bridge. Zimbabwe considers ourselves, we consider ourselves to be the gateway to Africa and to South Africa.
Okay.
And African Bank came to our assistance.
Right.
They've provided us lines of credit. They have now come up with, as you know, our economies, I'm sure about all other economies,
Right.
the SMEs are the backbone of our economies.
Yeah.
And African Bank has now come up with a plan to migrate business ideas into bankable projects.
All right.
That is the way, in my view, we should go.
All right.
To upgrade our SMEs so that they can take their proper place
Right.
in the Committee of Nations. You know, we were completely disindustrialized.
Yeah.
And because of their support, we are now food self-sufficiency.
Wow.
We grow our own wheat, our own maize,
Right.
because of the support that we received
right.
from African Bank.
You-
And I take this opportunity to thank Professor Benedict Orama for believing in Zimbabwe.
Absolutely. Okay, you're helping us move the conversation along, and that's where I want to go. But just before I introduce now the second component, Mr. Ki Chongli, I want to tap into your skill set, not just as a board member at Afrixim, but the work you've been doing generally in high finance. Many people say Africa's development at the initial phases will be powered by multilateral development banks. But at the tertiary phase, that's when you now need to see the commercial banks stepping in. That's when you need to see the market take over. Your experience in trying to link up African Bank with commercial banks and other financial institutions so that you create a diverse ecosystem. Can you tell us about how that works? Because my understanding is we need all hands on deck.
Thank you for your question. So we need to have a blended finance model, which is the model of Afrixim, where you tap on the private sector and on government. But more than this is a financial sovereignty. Because when Africa has its own mission for development, it has, as former minister said, it has to do it its own way with its own means. And this is what Afrixim has been doing. And I was very lucky to participate in one such exercise, which I'll elaborate a little bit, because when we wanted to increase capital of the bank, we came up with the idea of a depository receipt, which is derived from the shares of Afrixim Bank. And when we did the depository receipt, normally what we will do is we go to JP Morgan, we go to Goldman Sachs to advise. But in this case, we never went to any foreign banks to advise. Right. We relied on our own African institutions to raise the money. We depended on African private companies and individuals to put money into that depository receipt. And we listed it into an African stock exchange. In that case, the Mauritius Stock Exchange, with a Mauritian custodian bank. So all the instruments and all the institutions that made that capital raise possible were purely African. So this is the kind of financial sovereignty which we just heard, using your own means in your own way, which has made Afrixim such an innovative financial institution under the leadership, of course, of Professor Orama. And to add to that, is the fact that when you are independent on your own, then you can use innovative financial solutions. Right. So on top of that, what we created is we created an insurance management arm where credit risks that are not taken by the Western external insurers are now covered and managed by a subsidiary of Afrexim Bank with African reinsurers and African specialty skills and risk management capacity to do that insurance cover for African projects for the transformation of a continent.
Yes. Okay, so deepening capital markets liquidity to create that sovereignty. Professor Naji, perhaps now that example I'd ask for, because the second part of our conversation needs to look at transformation as much as we're talking about resilience. So, initially this was meant to be a lender for trade facilitation, but I think the mandate has been expanded. And in your experience, what is that expansion to the point that it leads to the transformation of how people transact, live, and work on the continent?
Thank you very much. The transformation that we're talking about, I think when we look at specifics, say infrastructure projects, they lead to trade. I'll use our own case as a good example. In the case of a project, we started about 20 years ago to do a project where everybody knows that electricity epilepsy is what we know in Nigeria. But so we said, let's create a model, and that model will be have integrated power. You have generation, you have distribution, all in one area. So we got a concession from government to do it, and that concession was the security of the whole project. So we didn't ask for sovereign guarantee. So fast forward, we got support to do the project up to some point. By the time after privatization, the government did something that essentially sent the project backward, in that the concession was breached. When the concession was now breached, we went into a 9-year stall. During this period, we went from one bank to another to try to get funds to complete. At that, when it was done, it was actually 95% complete. But by the time we went from one bank to another and there was no support, now we went to Afrexim Bank. And they were able to see through the issues. Other banks had stepped away. They were able to see through that this project is a good project, can help the economy of a region and the whole country by extension. And so they came rigorous, after years of due diligence, they were able to come through. And the project was now completed, commissioned. The outcome is phenomenal. So today, that place is the place that supplies electricity to about 4 million people, and it is the only city that you can, or commercial city you can say, has reliable electricity in Nigeria. I think that that's a credit to President Orama and his team for seeing through the cobwebs. They were able to see through all that and be able to finance this project. And the people are the beneficiaries. A lot of industries have come on stream. Some are moving into that place. That's what the sort of work that they do can energize.
Okay, so transformation from your experience is looking at an interesting funding model that helped to reform an electricity distributor. With that distribution, local businesses were powered, schools, hospitals, people's lives changed because there's now reliable energy, and entrepreneurs can just be entrepreneurs, and you move on.
It's a huge manufacturing environment, so trade across Africa, not just West Africa, but Southern Africa, the various products, garment industries, leather products, products, so many aspects. That's what it's about.
Mr. Aliu Ahmed, your definition of transformation, and I'm going to add future preparing, because transformation in today's context means you modernize African economies, you value add and produce locally, as we heard, you create jobs for young people. What is the role of an Afro-Exim Bank in the transformation that Africa needs today?
And based on our experience, let me look at primary goods, where agricultural goods in particular. For many years, Nigerians have produced all sorts of agricultural goods and exported them abroad. And oftentimes, you know the tragedy. These goods will arrive their destination in Europe and return to the country because they will be certified low quality and not sufficient for the environment in which they were exported. What did we do with African Exim Bank, and what did they do? They said, look, we could easily solve this problem by creating a quality assurance center for you. And Nigeria is currently hosting, it's completed a couple of years ago. We launched it in Ogun State. Mm-hmm. So this center is now responsible for facilitating and certifying the quality of every product right from the beginning. From the seeds that you sow. These seeds have to be tested in the labs. The kind of fertilizer you're going to use, you'll be advised on the nature of the fertilizer. So when the product comes out, it will now attain the standard that is required. So going forward, transformation for us in this huge area of that we have will mean that we're going to be able to expand our export products of goods and services, especially in the agricultural area. That is one area in terms of transformation. The second area, if I may, it's what was recently launched in Guru, which is the Africa America Center of Excellence. Right. For anybody who could afford it in Nigeria, the moment you have some discomfort or you have a health challenge, the next thing is you get onto the flight and you fly abroad. Right. This has the tendency, and if you look at the composition of the flow of foreign exchange, CBN governor was here earlier on, it was a huge component of our foreign exchange, health tourism. So with this facility in place now, world-class facilities, everybody has seen it, is going to potentially transform our health system in a massive way.
Okay. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to defer to our last two panelists, but I'll start with you, Rosa Whitaker, and say, trade was the bedrock upon which Afro-Exim Bank was established in 1993. That 30 years. We've obviously moved on. But we're still living in a world where African goods and producers need to be integrated in global value chains. We've seen with the Ukraine Crisis Adjustment Trade Facility how that external shock of war, they stepped in to sort of say, local manufacturers and agricultural producers, let's make you resilient as we see a decline in grain stock. So the world as we see it in its complexity, how do we continue to transform through an Afro-Exim Bank when it feels like when you move 5 steps forward, geopolitics pulls you 10 steps back, 5 steps forward, back, and we keep doing this thing?
Well, I think that the world, as you said, is being reordered right in our very presence. And Africa cannot afford to be a spectator in this process, nor can it afford to wait in line for international help. So in a way, that has been the silver lining in this crisis, that Africa can really, at the end of the day, only depend on Africa. And I think one of the best things we can do as a global Africa, and this is what Afro-Exim Bank has done, is to develop an African economic blueprint, which Afro-Exim Bank has done. We have to address the crisis of confidence, which is really the bedrock. Because if you don't believe that you can, then you won't. And Afro-Exim Bank didn't even wait for all of Africa to go along or the world to go along. When there was a crisis, whether it's from the pandemic to Ukraine, Afro-Exim Bank moved and people saw. When Afro-Exim Bank delivered north of 35% ratio in return to its shareholders, the world stood up and said, wait a minute, what about those risks? I watched Professor Arama and the Afro-Exim Bank, I watched them exit those conversations where they were arguing about perceived African risk and real African risk. They rather just demonstrated to the world that we can manage those risks and we to deliver. So what I would say today, we don't need to go back to the drawing board. We need to build on what we know is working and to appreciate the reality that in this world, we Africans have Africans.
Right. So I've heard a few new phrases, economic sovereignty, more investment, confidence, building resilience and transformation. The last word goes to you, Honorable Patrick Chinamasa. And this future we're talking about, you said we need to be not just exporting raw materials, but beneficiating, value addition, reindustrializing, keeping manufacturing here, thinking about supply chains within Africa. How do you see the expanded role of Afro-Exim Bank in that future you are calling us to reimagine?
Let me just highlight the major challenges. We have almost 30 million of our talented people in the diaspora. We need Afro-Exim Bank to find a plan to harness that skill and talent for repowering our reindustrialization. Another major challenge is connectivity between our respective countries. We don't have a road that comes from Cairo to Cape Town. So we need Afro-Exim Bank to help in the building of infrastructure that can crisscross the continent, which is not exactly the case right now. Yeah. Also, we find that there is no harmonization of our respective regulations, border regulations across the continent. We have 55 countries. We need to take a decision. We can't afford to have one decision being taken 55 times in individual countries. We need strong regional groupings, which, when they take a decision, that decision will be enforced in the member countries. We are saying we must reduce the bureaucracy. Yeah. We must increase inflow of both people and goods within our continent. And the problem right now is that we all trade with outsiders. We don't trade with each other. Yeah. Again, because maybe we produce the same things. Yeah. We all produce cobalt, chrome. And until we manufacture goods, and we then can be able to reduce Africa external trade and increase intra-investment and trade.
Right. I want to thank you all for your time. We've run out of time. But may I use the last 1 minute and break the rules with a little bit of latitude? The question is, what does the Afro-Exim experiment teach us? You use the word sovereignty. You've used the word confidence. So in one word, what does it teach us, Patrick Chinamasa?
It teaches us that we should have African banks which are centered on promoting African economic interests. Okay. We cannot have banks which take political decisions before they lend to individual countries.
Fantastic. Bart Naji, what does it teach us?
Sorry, what was the question?
What does Afro-Exim Bank, the experiment, what does it teach us?
Oh,
In a sense.
What they have taught us is that we can. That if we think it and execute the plan, that we can achieve. That's what they do all the time. I see that.
That we can, that Africa can do it. Rosa Whittaker, what does it teach us?
I think it teaches us that the economic blueprint for Africa must be developed by Africans. You can have international partners, but they have to ascribe to the African vision.
Fantastic. Kee Chong Lee, what does it teach us?
I think the key word is intelligence. What we need is intelligent Africa, and this is shown by the fact that we are not just leveraging on the vast natural resources of Africa to transform Africa, but we are leveraging also all the intangible resources, creativity and intelligence of Africans to develop a new Africa. And now with a global Africa dimension.
And lastly, Aliyu Ahmed, what does this teach us?
I would say trust in our institutions, and really they need to empower Africa Exim to do a lot more so that we provide them with enough firepower to do a lot more, and ensure that African government continue to retain or preserve that preferred creditor status for Africa Exim Bank. It's very important so that they don't get unduly punished by others.
I want to say thank you so much to you, Ms. Rosa Whittaker, Mr. Kee Chong Lee, Mr. Aliyu Ahmed, Honorable Patrick Anthony Chinamasa, Professor Bart Naji. And I think we have answered the question, what does the Afrexim Bank experiment teach us as we power the resilience and transformation of Africa? Thank you.
Okay, that's it for the first half of the day. There's much more to come, and I guess as they say in Lagos, where I'm from here in Nigeria, they will say "Mi ò tí jẹun látàárọ̀ yìí o, ẹ jẹ́ ká jẹun àbí," which for those who don't speak Yoruba means let's eat, you've earned lunch. It's in the Grand Marquis tent right here in the hotel, the Grand Marquis tent right here in the hotel. Ushers are standing by to guide you. Please, let's be back here in about 40 minutes or so because we're a little bit behind times. I'll see you there.